everyone. Thank you for joining us in spite of the cold weather. Thanks to everyone who is here, and thanks to the people who are following online. I know that with the day today, some people have stayed at home or in the office. In case you are following online, remember that you can submit questions during the talk by sending the question below in the box below your viewing window. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Rachel Schwartz today. Rachel is an assistant professor of international and area studies at the University of Oklahoma. And as you know, she's a visiting fellow this semester. She's the author of a book titled Undermining the State from Within, the Institutional Legacies of Civil War in Central America, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. Rachel's book was based on her dissertation, which won the American Political Science Association Gabriel Almond Award for the best dissertation in comparative politics. And today she's going to introduce us to her new book project, which is about international anti-corruption commissions, elite manipulation, and democratic backsliding in Latin America.
Thank you so much, Angival. Thank you all for being here on this very chilly morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to share some ongoing research with you all. Before I get started, I do want to mention that this is part of a book project in progress, so I'm really interested in your feedback. I'm especially interested in shorter titles because I think I need to shorten the title here. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I'd be very grateful. Again, the research that I'm going to be presenting today examines the origins, the trajectories, and the consequences of internationally backed efforts to tackle corruption and impunity in Central America. So I'm going to zoom in on a particular part of this book project in progress and show, I hope, how the design of international anti-corruption initiatives, whether they're a product, right, of how they come about, whether they're a product of civil society pressures or they're more leader-led initiatives, how that has an effect on their operations subsequently, particularly the kinds of autonomy that they enjoy. So the book project overall takes as its point of departure the growing global policy conversation on corruption and its relationship to international security specifically. So corruption, as I'm sure many of you know, has long been considered a dire challenge when it comes to development at the domestic level, right? So political, economic, bureaucratic actors, when they engage in corruption, they siphon off state resources, often at the expense of human development and economic growth. But I think in recent decades, we've seen a growing conversation, a growing recognition that corruption is not just a development. It's also a pressing international security challenge as well. So corruption, as we know, also breeds mistrust between citizens and governments because public officials are seen as enriching themselves at the expense of providing much needed public goods and services. And in extreme cases, this can sort of create a breach, create a void in which non-state armed actors can enter the equation and exert substantial influence, oftentimes also capturing state institutions and undermining security. So I think this figure, which was produced by Transparency International, illustrates this relationship between the degree of security threats and corruption, the extent of corruption quite clearly. So this is from 2022. And we see, right, a pretty clear pattern in which those countries that perform worse on the Corruption Perceptions Index, as indicated by the lower CPI scores on the x-axis, also experience the highest levels of security threat. And so we've seen, I think, this framing of corruption as a security issue also lead to the proliferation of international efforts to tackle it. And so we've seen the emergence of this broader international anti-corruption regime, which very much took off following 2005 when the United Nations General Assembly ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. However, I think that amid these efforts, we have also seen some facets, some really thorny challenges that make corruption a particularly difficult nut to crack. So first, there's a kind of fundamental dilemma here, which is that tackling large-scale government corruption requires political will on the part of the very officials that benefit from corruption, right? High-level political authorities and other power brokers. And so I think a great example of this, an illustrative instance of this that I found in my research is I remember talking to, in 2016, Guatemalan political analysts who went on to become a presidential candidate, actually, and I was talking to him about Guatemala's efforts to tackle corruption. And he said to me, listen, asking the Guatemalan government to combat corruption in Guatemala is like asking Dracula to stand guard over the blood bank. You're just simply not going to get the results that you're looking for, right? So that's one issue. But I think despite this sort of domestic challenge, we also have an international challenge here, which is that the international community currently has very little appetite, I would say, to impose the kinds of top-down maximalist solutions that we've perhaps seen in the past, because they require a lot of resources. And I also think there's a broader recognition that these kinds of top-down impositions are often ineffective absent some kind of local buy-in, right? And so to navigate this dilemma, international involvement to fight corruption has taken a kind of hybrid form. So international organizations and government leaders agreed to the creation of what I call in the project International Anti-Corruption Commissions, or IACCs, in which we have international experts collaborating with domestic personnel in order to investigate and prosecute corruption, raise a sort of anti-corruption consciousness or awareness within society, as well as propose institutional reforms. So these IACCs are what are similar, or a version of what scholar John Ciccari has referred to as shared sovereignty arrangements, as well as what Ayla Matinock has referred to as a form of governance delegation, right? And so the hybrid quality of these kinds of commissions is thought to be positive in a number of ways. So one, it's thought to insulate anti-corruption efforts from undue political, economic, and criminal influence. It's also thought to be useful for building greater internal legitimacy, because again, these are based on partnerships between international organizations and domestic authorities. And also, a lot of proponents of these types of initiatives say that they're much more conducive to actually transferring capacities and expertise from international authorities to domestic actors, so that the domestic institutions can eventually stand on their own. However, there's also a catch here, which is that these kinds of shared sovereignty arrangements, these kinds of governance delegation arrangements, they entail significant domestic government authority over what these kinds of initiatives actually look like, right? Domestic political actors must actually authorize the introduction of entities like IACCs. They typically do so through international agreements. And so this leads to a potential that domestic governments can sort of limit the scope of an IACC's work. It also means that domestic governments must reauthorize or renew the mandate of these kinds of entities every few years. And so that essentially gives them a kind of off-ramp should they want to remove the International Anti-Corruption Commission. So IACCs have been discussed as a solution to corruption in many different countries around the world, particularly in Latin America. But these entities were in large part first pioneered in the three northernmost Spanish-speaking countries of Central America, which sometimes is referred to as the Northern Triangle. These are the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So the first IACC was Guatemala's International Commission Against Impunity, which was authorized in 2008 when the United Nations, its sort of international sponsor, came to an agreement with the then government of Oscar Bercher. So again, this body, the CICIG, becomes operational in 2008. 7 years later, in 2015, discussions in Honduras begin for the creation of its own IACC, which becomes known as the Support Mission Against Corruption and Impunity in Honduras. Rather than the United Nations, this body is backed by the Organization of American States, the OAS, and it becomes operational in 2016. And then finally, in 2019, shortly after the inauguration of El Salvador's now president, Nayib Bukele, we see the creation of what becomes known as the CCS, the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador. This also, like Honduras's commission, is sponsored by and backed by the Organization of American States. So, believe it or not, it's hard to overstate the level of international backing, international support for these commissions in their early days. So particularly in the context of growing northbound migration from these countries, concerns about organized criminal penetration, these kinds of anti-corruption commissions become seen as a way to get at the root causes, right? We're very familiar now with this term, being in the United States and listening to policy discourse, the root causes of some of these ills faced in Central America, according to the international policy community, right? So for example, the CICIG, which had really scored some very important convictions by the mid-2010s and had unveiled some very wide-ranging and powerful criminal schemes within the state, was praised in a joint statement of Canada, Sweden, the UK, and the EU writ large in 2017, when these actors recognized and applauded the advances of the CICIG and reaffirmed the CICIG as an important ally for strengthening the rule of law and equitable and sustainable development. The MOXIE, for its part, garnered very similar praise for the anti-corruption inroads that it made. And so, for example, a bipartisan statement from several key members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, including now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, lauded the MOXIE as crucial in Honduras's fight against impunity, and integral to the country's efforts to uphold the rule of law. But despite this quite robust international backing, the story of Central America's international anti-corruption commissions does not end all that happily. So, in late 2019, Guatemalan President Jimmy Morales refuses to renew the CICIG's mandate. This comes after his relationship with the CICIG had soured quite dramatically when it began investigating his son and his brother for fraud. Eventually, Morales' own party would come under investigation for illicit campaign finance. And so he essentially, with the backing of the Guatemalan legislature, lets the CICIG's mandate run out, and it is dissolved in late 2019. Just a few months, really, after that, the Honduran Congress follows suit, and in early 2020, we see the MOXIE removed from Honduras. And then finally, a year later, after the CCS had opened pandemic-era fraud investigations into Bukele's own government, he also gives the Salvadoran commission the boot. Now, I think it's also really important to note here that the sort of dissolution of all three of these international anti-corruption commissions coincided with quite dramatic patterns of democratic erosion in these three countries, particularly Guatemala and El Salvador. So in 2023, the Varieties of Democracy Project, WIDEM's annual report found that El Salvador and Guatemala were two of the world's fastest autocratizing countries over the previous 3 years. So I think that the sort of story of Central America's international anti-corruption commissions, from when their seeds were first planted to their aftermath, raised some really important questions about international support for combating corruption and impunity. And those questions are the focus of the book. So there are three questions around which the book sort of revolves. The first has to do with the design of these international anti-corruption commissions. Why do some enjoy greater autonomy than others? A second question has to do with the sort of domestic elite backlash to these international anti-corruption efforts. And I try to understand under what conditions domestic political and other elites are able to neutralize the operations of these IACCs. And then the final question that the book is going to tackle has to do with this connection between international anti-corruption efforts and democracy. So why in some cases have we seen these give way to quite dramatic instances of democratic backsliding? Now, I think these research questions are also linked to some really important policy puzzles and policy questions as well. Especially as a lot of observers have sort of said that this is a really terrific model that actually produces tangible gains, and it should be, in fact, exported to other countries dealing with similarly high levels of endemic corruption and impunity. And I must admit that I am one of those people who has said this. So in the conclusion of my book, my first book, Undermining the State from Within, The Institutional Legacies of Civil War, I kind of have this sort of throwaway few sentences in the conclusion where I essentially say that dealing with some of these deeply rooted criminal structures within the state require the kinds of intensive anti-corruption efforts like what we see in Guatemala with the IACC. So I say that these are critical anti-corruption solutions because they focus not just on prominent state officials in an isolated fashion, but instead integrate the political and economic spheres and target the broader distributional coalitions upholding the predatory rules of the game. Now, I'm not sure if anybody in this room has put something in the conclusion of a book or an article that subsequently kind of gives you pause. I think my sort of rethinking or wanting to dive into these questions in a more nuanced way is really driven by conversations I've had with anti-corruption prosecutors and international officials working within these initiatives, many of whom are now in exile, right? As a result of the backlash to what they did during these anti-corruption campaigns. And so I think it's really important to sort of put some of these thorny policy questions front and center as well. Are these kinds of hybrid anti-corruption entities inevitably sort of victims of their own success, right? Are they sustainable? Are they bound to be pushed out once they achieve their most important gains? Relatedly, can we design them in a way that guards against this kind of elite backlash and subsequent democratic deterioration? Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to have very clear answers to those questions, but by the end of this research, but I am endeavoring to think through this quite intensively. So before I kind of dive into the section of the book that I want to discuss today, I just thought I'd give you all a sort of brief outline of how I'm thinking about it, what it's going to look like. So the first part of the book theorizes the evolution, the trajectory, and the consequences of international anti-corruption commissions, gives some contextual background on these Central American cases, and then I sort of dive in empirically to the three questions that I just mentioned. The question of design, right, degree of autonomy, the question of domestic backlash, so what do these counteroffensives by domestic elites look like, and when are they more or less successful in neutralizing anti-corruption efforts? And then finally, this piece about democracy and democratic backsliding. So that's kind of the general outline. I'm happy to talk about any of the pieces, of course, with the understanding that I'm still working on all of them. But for the remainder of today, I want to discuss my preliminary research on this first piece. So why we see variation in the degree of autonomy that these different commissions in the Central American cases have been granted. So before we get there, however, I think there's a sort of prior question that we have to answer, which is that why would a corrupt government open its doors to an international anti-corruption commission that's going to investigate malfeasance and graft within the political system? Why would they introduce these kinds of commissions in the first place, right? And so remember, IACCs imply a partnership between international and domestic authorities, and they require domestic consent, right? This is, as I mentioned, attractive, I think, for international organizations, international bureaucratic authorities, right? Because they are increasingly wary of these kind of very costly top-down types of interventions. But I think that this quality is also crucial to understand why domestic governments decide to allow IACCs in the first place. And so international anti-corruption commissions reflect a kind of arrangement that are governed by what scholars Susanna Campbell and Ayla Matnock describe in a recent article as incomplete contracts, right? They prioritize host government consent and national ownership, and they give the host government the authority to influence the content of the initiative's mandate, as well as how it's implemented. So in other words, the kinds of agreements that are used to create international anti-corruption commissions give domestic political actors the ability to determine the who, the what, the where, the how, and the when of these kinds of initiatives, right? So they have a say over the size and the composition of international personnel, the kinds of activities they can partake in, where they can operate, the kinds of immunities that they possess, as well as the time frame of their mandate. And so if I were a corrupt government leader, and I'm not a corrupt government leader, but if I were one, this degree of control, right, that I have over the design of an anti-corruption commission might mitigate the potential costs of bringing this kind of an entity into my country, right? By defining the IACC scope and its reach, rulers sort of perceive that they can garner the reputational benefits, right? That inviting in this international entity and appearing to conform to international anti-corruption norms, the reputational benefits that brings, while also sidestepping some of the most severe anti-corruption enforcement consequences of these types of bodies, right? By exerting control over what they can and cannot do. But this doesn't actually tell us when national leaders seeking to introduce yet subordinate an international anti-corruption commission is actually successful in doing so. And as I'll show in the 3 Central American cases, we see quite stark variation in the autonomy of these 3 international anti-corruption commissions. And so the goal of this part of the book is really to understand why we see that. And so this brings us to another question though. Does it even mean for an international anti-corruption commission to be autonomous, to be independent, right? How am I conceptualizing institutional autonomy here? And as sort of, I think many of the political scientists in the room will know, institutional autonomy is a really, really difficult, complex concept, right? And it's even more so here because we're talking about institutions that are not purely international, nor are they purely domestic agencies, right? And so my conceptualization combines both the international and domestic dimensions. And I essentially argue that IACC autonomy consists essentially of 2 things. First is the ability of international bureaucratic authorities within the commission to engage in investigative and prosecutorial activities. The second has to do with the independence of the domestic agencies that international anti-corruption commissions partner with. So, where we have international authorities that can directly participate in investigating and prosecuting corruption cases, and where they partner with independent agencies, like say a special unit within the independent public prosecutor's office, I consider these to be vested with high levels of autonomy. By contrast, where we see international IACC staff is more confined to a kind of advisory or technical assistance role, and where we see domestic partner agencies under the influence of political actors, specifically the executive, I would argue that they possess low levels of autonomy. And then finally, there's a kind of middle ground here as well. So where we see elements of high autonomy and low autonomy in terms of the international and domestic dimensions, or vice versa, right? We would say that the IACC has moderate autonomy. Also, where we see a sort of mix of high and low autonomy features within these dimensions. So let's say international personnel can engage in investigations, but they can't litigate cases, right? Or they can't present cases before national judges, right? We would consider them to have moderate levels of autonomy. So turning now to sort of my theoretical effort to explain this variation in IACC autonomy, we begin sort of with a scenario in which it seems reasonable to think that domestic authorities would want to exert maximum control over these commissions and their activities, right? These are threatening bodies if they operate in a way that they are intended to, right, writ large. So the question becomes, when do they succeed in actually exerting that control, and when do these bodies, despite these efforts to control them, actually become designed with much more independence? And so to answer this question, I argue first that we need to understand International Anti-Corruption Commission design as the outcome of domestic distributive conflict, right? We have competing social, political, and economic actors. They're facing diverse pressures and incentives. They contest the process of IACC design with those in mind, and who prevails in those contests ultimately matters for the kinds of autonomy that these commissions are granted. And so the first distinction that I draw is whether IACC pressure is primarily derived from civil society mobilization, or whether it occurs through the initiative of domestic leaders who are guided by more self-interested and particularistic motives. So in some cases, IACC pressures may come chiefly from outside government, as domestic civil society organizations lobby executive and legislative authorities to bolster the rule of law through international support. And I argue that this process, this kind of pressure, is more likely to induce more autonomous commissions in terms of their design, because by lobbying domestic politicians, by bringing public awareness to the IACC campaign, and by leveraging the expertise and assistance of international partners, domestic civil society actors can promote blueprints for more autonomous IACC design. They can also raise the domestic and international costs of regime attempts to sort of water down or curtail the independence of these kinds of commissions, right? However, these bodies might not emerge through robust civil society pressures, but instead through the initiatives of politicians themselves. So again, if rulers believe that they can manipulate the design of an international anti-corruption commission as well as its operation, they may see adoption as a way to further their own self-interests. So these self-interests can sort of run the gamut. There can be a variety of them, right? So on the one hand, IACC adoption in this sort of leader-led model might be about winning or retaining power through elections, right? So in places where corruption and impunity are leading issues on the electorate's mind, political competition may foster these promises to introduce an international anti-corruption commission. However, we would expect commissions established under these conditions to lack autonomy because they are chiefly meant to win support, win electoral support rather than crack down on corruption. Beyond elections, rulers may adopt IACCs to quiet domestic unrest amid corruption scandals, right? So corruption scandals, especially those involving the sitting government, can motivate leaders to invite in a commission to signal a break with the past, the corrupt past. However, as in the case of impending elections, we wouldn't expect commissions created under these conditions to enjoy significant autonomy because, again, their purpose is to quiet domestic unrest, not combat corruption. Finally, rulers may not only envision international anti-corruption commissions as a means of garnering support, but even more cynically, they may see them as, in fact, tools, instruments that they can weaponize against their political opponents. And so this idea mirrors the concept that's put forward by Courtney Hillebrecht and Scott Strauss, who look at why countries cooperate with the International Criminal Court in an article published a little over a decade ago. And they make the argument that cooperation with the ICC in this case serves as what they call an international legal lasso. It's a way of removing your own domestic challengers from the political equation, in that case by sending them off to the ICC, in this case by putting them in the crosshairs of an international anti-corruption commission. So it's not hard to imagine, right, these kinds of bodies being instrumentalized and weaponized for a regime to go after their own political opponents by alleging corruption. Of course, we can also see a sort of mix of civil society and leader-led modes of IACC design and introduction. And so there's also a kind of middle ground here, moderate level of autonomy. So that's the sort of domestic piece of the theory here. But I also argue that viewing institutional design just through the lens of distributive conflict, yes, it can help us understand these competing domestic forces and how they struggle to shape IACC autonomy, but these struggles do not unfold in isolation. Domestic politicians refine their playbooks in response to the experiences of their neighbors. In other words, there's a sort of transnational political learning story here as well. By seeing the ways in which anti-corruption campaigns overcome intended roadblocks and make progress, rulers may adopt new approaches to shackle IACCs and limit the possibilities of anti-corruption enforcement. In other words, corrupt political leaders learn from one another, right? I know Marianne has worked on this topic in terms of these forms of authoritarian learning, right? They assess the observed utility of prior government responses to international anti-corruption support, and they calibrate their own strategies and actions accordingly. And so we would expect the domestic struggles underlying IACC creation, these sort of motivations and preferences, to also be crucially informed by prior experiences. So where leaders learn from the missteps of their regional counterparts, they're better able to sort of rein in IACCs in the design phase. So that's the sort of conceptual and theoretical background. I promise I'm getting closer to actually talking about Central America. But before I get into that very quickly, so empirically in the project, I engage in within and cross-case qualitative analysis to examine the process of IACC establishment in these three countries and how they sort of diverge or converge vis-a-vis one another. And here I employ a form of comparison that's kind of fallen out of fashion, but I hope it's kind of coming back. It's what Charles Tilly referred to back in the day as encompassing comparison, right? So encompassing comparisons not only juxtapose the trajectories of individual component cases, but they also analyze how their positioning vis-a-vis one another and the larger whole shape these trajectories. And so I examine this evolution as well as the trajectory and consequences of international anti-corruption commission cases with attention to sort of how they shape one another. So in terms of data, the book draws on a number of qualitative data sources with the help of Nico Cabrera Schneider, who's a terrific grad student at Tulane University. I assembled a collection of articles from leading news sources across Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, as well as international NGO reports and government reports and communiques, domestic legislation, international agreements. And so this corpus is about 1,100 documents. I also conducted elite interviews in Guatemala, Honduras, and Washington, D.C. with former government officials, anti-corruption prosecutors, international authorities, civil society leaders, and journalists. So turning now to the 3 Central American cases, I'm going to start with Guatemala. So in Guatemala, we see the central role of domestic civil society, whose sustained organization, lobbying, and bridge building across domestic and international organization spheres not only spurred the adoption of what became the IACC, but also prevented politicians from severely limiting the Commission's autonomy. So, what's the backstory of the IACC? So the seeds of the IACC were sown during Guatemala's peace process in the early and mid 1990s, which produced a series of provisions as well as Truth Commission reports that first alluded to the sort of criminalization of the state as a result of illicit counterinsurgent structures that survived from war to peace. These were sort of termed CIACs, Cuerpos Ilegales y Aparatos Clandestinos de Seguridad. If you go to Guatemala and you say CIACs, everybody knows what you're talking about. It's very much become part of the vernacular. So this idea can be found in the 1994 Comprehensive Agreement on Human Rights. And the Guatemalan government in this accord undertakes a commitment to ensuring that these groups embedded in the state would be dismantled. The United Nations, which helped broker Guatemala's peace process, which backed one of the 2 Truth Commission reports produced in the country, was also crucial to monitoring progress towards this goal, working very intensively with human rights defenders to shed light on these groups' continued illicit, corrupt activities. Having rebuilt organizational ties and mobilizing capacity during the peace process, Guatemalan civil society sort of leverages this work to then lobby for international support to strengthen the rule of law, especially as violent attacks against those pursuing truth and justice in the aftermath of the conflict continue to escalate under the first government elected following the signing of peace, that of right-wing populist Alfonso Portillo. And so eventually Portillo accedes to these pressures for the creation of a UN-backed commission with the power to investigate the structure and activities of these illegal groups, their modalities of operation, their sources of financing, and to initiate prosecutions against them. Within the Portillo administration, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, a guy by the name of Edgar Gutierrez, had deep roots in Guatemala's human rights community and becomes a sort of internal champion of this proposal. So there's a first iteration of the IACC proposal. It's called the CCX, the International Commission Against CX. And it's granted vast authority, including authority to international prosecutors who are able to essentially select cases, investigate cases, litigate cases on their own. This ends up leading Guatemala's constitutional court to declare the proposal unconstitutional because on national sovereignty grounds. However, continued civil society pressure does not allow this proposal to sort of fade off of the national policy agenda. Instead, the subsequent government of Oscar Verche ends up sort of remaining committed to the idea. And it also has a key champion within government who's pictured here, Vice President Eduardo Stein, who's shown shaking hands with the IACC's first commissioner, Carlos Castresana. And so eventually what we get is a commission in which international prosecutors, international personnel can still participate fully in investigations and in bringing cases before national courts. However, they must do so alongside national counterparts. We also see the creation of a special prosecutor's office against impunity, known as the FESI. And this office enjoys quite substantial autonomy in order to work with the CICIG and investigate these cases. And so the story of Guatemala is very much a story of a commission deeply rooted in civil society in a lot of ways. The sustained lobbying of a broad, well-connected civil society coalition made it possible to secure the CICIG's operational independence. Now, the story of Honduras's MACC is somewhat distinct. So this is a case in which we don't see as strong of an organized civil society relative to Guatemala. And so IACC pressures emerge from elsewhere, specifically a high-profile corruption scandal that sparks mass mobilization. The scandal, however, also collided with the incumbent government's re-election ambitions. And so the government ends up channeling this public outcry into IACC negotiations, but they're negotiations that sideline civil society and eventually give rise to a commission that has some autonomy, but not full autonomy or not significant autonomy in the way that Guatemala's commission has. So what is the nature of this scandal that sets the stage for Honduras's MACC to take shape? So in 2015, prosecutors uncover a massive corruption scheme within Honduras's Social Security Institute, in which the ruling government of the National Party had essentially funneled $355 million into its own party coffers and into its own campaigns. This happened, the case that was undertaken was related to the 2013 election. And then President Juan Orlando Hernandez of the National Party admits that somewhere around $3 million of this 355 is funneled directly into his presidential campaign. And so this sets off mass mobilization. People in Honduras, calling themselves the indignados, flood the streets. They demand Hernandez's resignation, and they demand a CICIG-like body to tackle endemic corruption and impunity. But it's also important to note that this is happening just months after the National Party allied Supreme Court had scrapped a constitutional ban on presidential re-election, allowing Hernandez to run again, something that he fully intended to do. So under this pressure and given the electoral incentives, the Honduran president and Congress go to not the United Nations, but the Organization of American States to establish a corruption fighting mission. And thus the MACC is born in 2016 through a fairly quick process, series of negotiations that very much ice out civil society. And there are some notable constraints that are placed on the MACC. So first, Honduran political elites ensured that the MACC did not have the same prosecutorial and investigative authority as the CICIG, as within the CICIG. So the MACC could assist in investigations, it could provide technical assistance, but it could not present cases before the national court system. Another constraint is that Hernandez recurs to the Organization of American States, which observers saw very much as a deliberate move to empower a weaker organization. I think it's also important to note, and I heard this a lot in my interviews in Honduras last summer, that the OAS was also subject to much more consequential political entanglements in the region. So specifically, current OAS Secretary General, Luis Almagro, was himself seeking a second term at the helm of the OAS. and was looking for the Honduran government's vote. And so there's a sort of sense that there's a sort of quid pro quo at work here. Another series of constraints was that Honduran officials also strategically broadened the scope of the MACC and its activities to take the focus off of criminal prosecution. So the MACC's mandate includes 4 areas. It does include investigation of corruption and prosecution of corruption, but it also includes police reform, it includes campaign finance reform, and it includes judicial system reforms, vetting of judges, right? And so these are all in and of themselves good things, but this was very much a move that emerged out of the critique they had of the CICIG, that the CICIG was too focused on the judicialization of cases. And there were all these other issues that needed to be tackled as well. And so it was a kind of watering down of the prosecutorial piece of the MACC's mandate, right? And so we end up overall seeing a case here in which high-profile corruption scandal and resulting mass protest sort of get channeled as a result of electoral incentives into this leader-led form of IACC creation. And so we do not get quite the degree of autonomy in the Honduran case that we see in Guatemala. So the final case is that of El Salvador's CCS. And this is a spoiler alert. This is an international anti-corruption commission that is not really created to fight corruption at all. It is created to target the government's political opponents. And as a result, it is vested with very, very little autonomy. So the backstory of CCS. In 2019, Nayib Bukele, populist outsider figure, former mayor of San Salvador, won the presidency in El Salvador. He defeated the 2 parties that had been alternating power since the Salvadoran peace process, the left-wing FMLN and the right-wing Arena. And Bukele very much runs on a platform decrying corruption within these 2 mainstream parties and promises during his campaign to address them through the creation of IACCs, an International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador. So as with MACC, CCS's partnership with the OAS rather than the UN was seen by observers as sort of undercutting anti-corruption efforts by empowering a weaker international partner. But this is not the only way in which the Bukele administration tries to sort of clip the wings of the CCS. So unlike the MACC and the CICIG before it, the agreement that the OAS and Salvadoran government forged houses the CCS under the executive branch and limits its operations to auditing and providing technical assistance to the offices of the presidency. So understandably, there were serious suspicions that the CCS would try to usurp the work of the Attorney General, that it would lack the necessary independence to combat corruption. And Bukele, of course, assured critics that the CCS will not be utilized for political purposes to persecute his opponents. His announcement of its creation just cites these corruption scandals within the previous Arena and FMLN administrations, while not making clear at all that these investigations could be directed at his own administration. And so eventually, CCS does begin investigating the Bukele government. That's a really interesting piece of all of this, is that despite the constraints, at least in all 3 cases, but especially the 2 more constrained commissions, the MACC in Honduras and the CCS in El Salvador, they exceed those, right? They overcome those and make much more progress than they were ever meant to make. So that's another piece I'm happy to sort of chat about more in the Q&A. But this sort of effort to combat pandemic-related corruption within the Bukele administration leads him to dissolve the commission. And so the case of CCS in El Salvador is very much one of an IACC that's really only intended to go after corruption in ways authorized by the executive, which of course requires its complete political subordination and lack of autonomy. So sort of I promise I'm getting to the end here, but stepping back a bit, sort of what do we see happening here, right? So first, we see a distinction when it comes to whether the IACC emerged through civil society pressures or whether it was a ruler-led initiative motivated by more particularistic interests. So as I mentioned, in Guatemala, we have a very lengthy coalition building process that begins with the peace agreements, and it forges a sort of broad front that leverages key linkages in the international community and within the sitting government, within successive Guatemalan administrations, and thus produces a CC with quite high autonomy. By contrast, in Honduras, civil society is not as organized and as robust. And so instead, it's high-profile corruption scandal, mass mobilization that generates this window of opportunity. However, because of Hernandez's reelection aims, there's a need for him to kind of save face and mark a break with the path. And so he sort of co-opts this window of opportunity to impose a commission that enjoys some autonomy, but is constrained in quite significant ways. Finally, in El Salvador, we see government OAS negotiations without civil society involvement, like in Honduras, but we also don't see the kind of bottom-up pressures that we saw in Honduras. Instead, this proposal is made in the context of an election, and it very clearly sought to create a political weapon for the Bukele administration to neutralize its rivals. However, complicating the story more, we can't treat these three cases as independent because they're simply not. There are clear ways in which the sequencing of these commissions matter, right? And domestic leaders learn from prior IACC experiences of their neighbors. So for instance, in response to the significant advances in prosecuting corruption through the UN-sponsored IACC in Guatemala, what do Honduran and Salvadoran leaders do? They instead engage in the sort of forum shopping and go with the OAS, right? In Honduras, the Hernandez government strategically broadens the work of the IACC to take the focus off of criminal prosecution. The Honduran government also restricts the faculties of international bureaucratic authorities within the within the IACC, right? So that's another sort of piece of course correction based on the CC experience. And then in El Salvador, in some ways, these dynamics of political learning go even further. The government subordinates CCS to the executive, confines its role to sort of an advisory or technical assistance function, even while sort of positioning it as parallel to CC and IACC, and leveraging the popularity of these commissions. Bukele, of course, also doesn't hide the fact that CCS is really meant to, in his eyes, go after corruption committed by his political opponents. And so stepping back sort of even further, what are some of the key takeaways here? So first, again, these are not independent cases, and I think we have to, when we think about these kinds of shared sovereignty arrangements, like international anti-corruption commissions, we have to incorporate a sort of transnational focus. We have to understand how these cases are influencing one another, right? In Central America, in these three Central American cases, we see relatively clearly how political elites sort of seize the reputational benefits of inviting in IACCs while also learning from one another how to constrain their authority and their activities. The dismantling of these three bodies, which I didn't talk about in tremendous depth, also reveals sort of similar dynamics of learning. And so I think this is a really important piece that we need to incorporate more into our analysis. Second, unfortunately, I think we also need to remain quite skeptical, right, of these kinds of bodies and the kinds of motivations and incentive structures underlying these commissions. So yes, it's possible that you get a genuine multi-sectoral consensus, as we see in Guatemala, but developing that coalition took a lot of time. The CC proposal experienced these kinds of fits and starts, right? And by contrast, we see in Honduras and El Salvador that sort of when you get a singular champion of an international anti-corruption commission, which is being developed without civil society input, that should set off alarm bells, right? And I think this point is particularly relevant right now, given what's happening in Honduras, and I'd be more than happy to discuss this in the Q&A. But since the election of Hernandez's successor, leftist leader Xiomara Castro, we have seen this sort of campaign to establish a UN-backed International Anti-Corruption Commission to replace the MACC, which was dissolved in 2020. This commission, the proposal, everybody is referring to as CC, so CC, but with an H instead of a G, right? And the Castro administration has, this was part of her sort of campaign platform, and they have been in talks with the United Nations since she was inaugurated in early 2022. Now, this commission has not come to fruition. If I had the money to put a bet on it, I would say it's not going to come to fruition. And we see a lot of the kind of motives underlying this current Honduran proposal that we saw in the previous Honduran proposal and in the case of El Salvador. So I think this is something that we have to remain attuned to as well. And then finally, the insights from this part of the project also, I think, have implications for other aspects of international anti-corruption commissions, including their longevity. Perhaps it's not a coincidence, right, that the most independent IACC of the three cases I presented, built on the most solid coalitional foundations, lasted for a little over a decade. Meanwhile, the other two lasted for far less time, right? The CCS for just over 2 years, right? And so I think this shows that IACC is driven by leaders' cynical political calculations and vested with limited autonomy may eventually run into turmoil as anti-corruption crusaders kind of seek to push them beyond their limits, right? So I'm gonna wrap things up there, but thank you very much for your attention, and I look for your comments.
Sorry, this reminds me of my wife's and my good friend Rosmarie Guatemala. Have you heard of her?
Rosmarie?
Guatemala.
No.
Well, she was hired by the OAS to do the peace agreement in El Salvador. And so that was a very difficult kind of thing, right? She ended up putting everything together and even creating the new army of El Salvador with the combination of the guerrilla and of the army. That was incredible. So she was doing this in I think it was 2006. When she was then hired by the United Nations to do the Guatemala CC that you mentioned. And at that point, they were of course had to do with Efraín Montt, right? And so that was a big problem that they had. And she did succeed in putting together the commission and stayed in contact with them for about 3 years. And then she went back to Chile and retired. She lives still in Santiago. Now, the important thing about that is that they did prosecute a whole bunch of people. I mean, like in the hundreds, like 900 or something. So this was a very successful episode. Now, of course, it was cut short in 2016. And what coincides with that? Trump's election. So this time when I just got in touch with, in other words, this was an initiative that perhaps would have continued had it not been for Trump.
Yeah, so should I take a couple of questions and then?
Yeah, we have a virtual question from John. Even though your focus is on different geographic regions, how might your relevant and overlapping experience apply in any possible way to help the immediacy of the domestic situation here in the United States.
Okay. It's being recorded, right? Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. This quite literally touches home. I'm from Honduras.
Okay.
So thank you for researching Central America. Is very much needed. I was thinking during your presentation that the impact that CICIG had in Guatemala was perceived way better than Maxis in Honduras in terms of effectiveness to prosecute cases. One interesting part of this comparison is that CICIG's notion of corruption included a broad understanding of impunity.
Yeah.
Considering, for instance, impunity of crimes of the past or a very human rights approach.
Mhm.
Whereas Maxi mostly focused on corruption schemes and cases of the administration that was in power at the time.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if, apart from the procedural material conditions that you have explained today, under which these IACCs were created, have you considered these substantive differences and how they have affected their autonomy and their constitutionality?
Yeah, no, it's a terrific question. Yeah, take one more and then I'll.
Yeah, so this also touches on me, not because I'm from Honduras, but because I work for the Maxia, for the CCS. So I'm very familiar with the whole process of negotiation. Yeah, we have to talk. But very briefly, there are two, and I fully agree with your assessment,
Yeah.
by the way. But two things that I think you should consider into this research. One is the financial and funding aspect of these missions,
Yeah.
because even though we say that one was backed by the UN and the other two by the OAS, they are very limited in their scope by the donors. So I would say that even there were some negotiations that went through the embassies of the funding countries rather than the actual organization.
Yeah,
So they limit a lot what they can do, in which activities they can put funding on. So that's a very important aspect. And the other one, because it seems to me that this is a very elite-driven research, I would say that it's important just to have a more nuanced understanding of these missions, to separate the technical work with the political statements, even from the representatives and from the leaders of the organizations, because sometimes, not only in these missions, but in other international missions, the technical work is very relevant, it's very professional. People are hired from different countries. In the case of the Maxi, most of the people who work for the Maxi, they were not OAS employees. They were people that were hired internationally. They were vetted by Canada, by Switzerland. So they sometimes do like a really good job. And sometimes what they present contradicts the political statements of the representatives of the missions or the representatives of the organizations like the UN or the OAS. So it's hard to put in the same basket the whole work of the mission just in electoral negotiation between, Almagro and Juan Orlando Hernández. So I think that that's important. And the third thing, I'm going back to your presentation in the point 4 about the scope of this research. And you were mentioning that one of the issues that you see in these international commissions is that the presidents and the leaders always try to have a say in the scope of this organization. But for me, it's difficult to imagine any international agreement where the president is not trying to influence the scope of the agreement. And from my perspective, it's something good because those international efforts usually coming from Washington, where they're supposed to have the better ideas and the better experience and better democratic levels. But when they are trying to transplant these kind of institutions or effort to other contexts, maybe they might fail, as we have seen in Haiti. So I think that this is a broader discussion about the international cooperation and how does it work, or used to work at least, and not only about these missions. I mean, I think that the problem with this mission is we can see that with human rights agreements, with environmental agreements, with everything. And always, I think that it's a good thing that the leaders have an agency in how these agreements are developed, but to what extent is better or worse for the outcome of the project, that's something different. And I will send you my comments on that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I guess before taking another round of questions, I want to sort of pick up on this, because I think you're absolutely right, that this is, what I presented is very much a kind of stylized elite-led story. And you're absolutely right that the kind of technical work going on behind the scenes was extremely well done. And so like I don't need to tell you this because you worked at the MUXI, right? But what a lot of people told me during my research was that, so within the MUXI, there was clearly this sort of attempt by the Hernandez administration to sort of constrain, shape the contours, but they got in the agreement this notion of colaboración activa, right? And so this was absolutely critical to opening the door to greater international involvement on the sort of prosecutorial side, right? And so this, I think, goes back to, I think, what I think is an interesting phenomenon that we see in all three cases is that they very much exceeded what the people who were, the top people who were opening their doors to them ever imagined, right? And I would say that even in the case of CCS, where they actually did open investigations, right? And so that's another sort of, I think, important piece of the puzzle here. And it fits more into the second part of the book on sort of elite backlash and how these organizations manage that. But I think that's a really important point. And yeah, the financial constraints. Yeah, you're right. I frame this as kind of driven by these international organizations, but as we know, in all three cases, the United States government was deeply involved in. So I think unpacking that some more is really important. So thank you so much, and please, let's talk more. So Trump's election and the sort of geopolitical context absolutely was important. I would say though, so it becomes important in terms of the dissolution of these three commissions, and what I think is interesting and something that also fits in the second part of the book here has to do with how they sort of turned towards this discourse of national sovereignty even more during the Trump era as a way to delegitimize and discredit these three commissions. So in terms of their dissolution, the sort of broader geopolitical context and the Trump administration absolutely is a key part of the story. So I completely agree with that. Your question about sort of the more human rights-based approach of the CC versus the more sort of frontal attack on corruption from the MOXIE, absolutely an important part of the story, and Maida has sort of pushed me on that question as well previously, because the CC very much, it's a product of the pressure of the not just civil society writ large, the Guatemalan human rights community, which of course very much mobilized in the aftermath of the conflict. And so the question is, was that human rights sort of framing less threatening to the people in power as opposed to sort of central focus on corruption? And I'm not sure. I think I need to think this through a little more, because I think there could certainly be something to it. I think there are other factors though that explain this difference that I've been thinking through, and given that you know the Honduran case, I'm curious to hear what you think. But one of the factors is that I think, so the CC begins its work focusing much more on kind of individual cases, like individual people. So it goes after Alfonso Portillo, right? It goes after these other kind of high profile individuals. It doesn't touch economic elites. And so given Guatemala's extremely fragmented political landscape, it actually, I think for a lot of folks, becomes sort of seen as a weapon, like it's going after their opponents, right? Of course, the CC goes back and forth and eventually goes after everybody. But because there's greater political fragmentation, I think it's much harder to mount a counteroffensive to the CC in a way that we see happen so rapidly in Honduras. And by contrast, as we know, the Honduran political system, party system, is much more institutionalized. Of course, it's been disrupted some with the entry of Libre, but we have three major parties who have very well-worn traditions of sitting down, negotiating these things, right? We see it super clearly with how the Honduran Supreme Court is structured, right? And so I think that there's this, so the thing that kept coming up in my interviews in Honduras last year was people talked about this, they referred to it as a facilidad de transar. It's like you sit down, you hash it out, it's quick, you get it over with, everybody's happy, right? This kind of deal making. And so I think that that plays a role in allowing for a much stronger kind of counteroffensive, especially led by the Honduran legislature in Honduras than what we see in Guatemala. But I think your initial question, your initial point is really important and something we're thinking about more. Tom's question about the domestic situation in the United States. I study Central America to avoid the domestic situation. I think that there are a couple of things to think about, and it's funny because Laura Gamboa, who is of course faculty here, we've been talking about lessons from Guatemala for sort of the current moment. So I think there are a couple things. One, I think there's a tremendous need to stand up for and insulate people who stick their necks out to speak out in this moment. So what we've seen in the Guatemalan case in particular is a sort of effort in the aftermath of the IACC to criminalize anti-corruption prosecutors, critical civil society actors, journalists, and it's been quite swift, and it's led to dozens and dozens of people forced into exile. And I don't think the international community, here thinking about the United Nations and the United States, of course, I don't think they sort of foresaw or contemplated the need to think about how we protect those kinds of people. And so I think that that's a really sort of important takeaway. You know, I think the other takeaway, and I think unfortunately it's relevant for the United States, is that's, you know, the United States is different and there's a history of sort of stronger institutions. But whenever you have these kinds of islands of excellence, right, these pockets of tremendous expertise and technical experience and highly effective prosecutors or other agencies, right, that it's hard to sustain those absent political conditions that allow you to sustain those, right? These islands of excellence can easily be drowned, right, if they're in a sea of hostile political actors who are not committed to the rule of law and democracy. And so I think that, you know, at least in the Central American case, there's been a very large discussion, and these anti-corruption commissions were a part of it in terms of strengthening institutions. We need to strengthen institutions. But I think some of what I see, particularly in the Guatemalan case, is what happens when you strengthen institutions, but don't actually reform the political system, right? And so I think that is a sort of important thing we have to think about. Yeah, Juan Sebastián and Andres.
Well, this is something that we have talked about. It is about the judiciary, talking about strengthening institutions. Obviously, I can see the great benefits of having IACC and so on in order to isolate from the political realm the administration of justice and combating corruption. But in a way, you're telling us at the same time that not even those organizations, institutions can be isolated from political pressure. So that will lead me to my question of the first best, because I see IACC and so on as a second best. The first best for me would be to have a easier to say than to do it, have a completely independent, isolated judiciary, you know, kind of a structural reform, creating the political environment for the judiciary to flourish as an independent body. So that would be my question. You know, is the creation of these organizations that are needed? In the case of my country, it would be necessary to bring international assistance in the future. But are these organizations in a way competing or taking resources out of strengthening the formal administration of justice? kind of a, you know, I think it would be a good takeaway to see the effect of, given the fact that you mentioned that the one in Honduras and El Salvador lasted so little time too, thinking about sustainability.
Yeah, yeah, no, this is a really, really important question. Well, let me take Andres and then I'll.
Sure. I was going to ask something about courts, but I'll stick to the other one. So thank you. Juan. There are many parts that I enjoy about your work, and I stick to the institutional design contribution and the thinking about it. In thinking about this, sort of the broader institutional context of how divided or unified government, and the sense of legislative support of the president, can in fact enable or diminish the effectiveness of these groups. So let's think of a hypothetical case of a government that wants to improve government efficiency, would want to create a low autonomy agency with sort of a preemptive or proactive section to anticipate enemies and or weaponize enemies. That would be extremely possible under a unified government, of course, because even if you have the strong institutions we so much care about, they would effectively be unified to a perverse purpose. And I think that's an interesting dimension that's underlying in your work.
No, that's really interesting because I've been thinking about this unified versus divided government in terms of how it shapes the backlash to these things. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, Bukele in his first election wins outright in the first round, has a, you know, tremendous mandate in the face of, you know, these two traditional, extremely discredited, delegitimized political parties that have previously governed, right? And so I think that this is an important piece to think through a little bit more on the design side rather than just on the sort of backlash side. So thank you. Juan, this is a really interesting question and one that I'm continuing to grapple with. So I'm excited to continue to talk to you about it. I think that, you know, what's remarkable about the CICIG is that this whole idea of the transfer of capacities from international experts to domestic authorities, it actually happened. Like it actually did happen. In an interview I did with somebody who is very high up in the MEP and collaborated closely with the CICIG, said to me, like, by the time that the CICIG was being dissolved, it was Guatemalan technicians and investigators who were training the international people coming in. Like there really was, so I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, I guess. I don't want to say that this is not an effective model at all. I think that, so when proponents of it say that there's much more of a sense of internal legitimacy that gets developed, there's a greater ability to sort of transfer capacities, I think that we saw that in the case of the CICIG. And I don't think it took away resources necessarily. It provided some new resources that, at least for a short time after the CICIG was kicked out, persisted. For example, the creation of these special high impact courts, right, that are hearing these cases that were quite efficient and quite effective, right? The FESI, which has unfortunately been totally co-opted now by the current Attorney General, it still remained quite effective a year and a half or so after the CICIG was ousted. So I think this is less a story of this model being itself one that's bound to fail, and more a story about needing to create the correct political conditions to sustain this kind of anti-corruption. So, and then.
I wanted to offer a suggestion that might help think through the comment made by Andres, and I think to a certain extent the one made also by Ana. You started your talk by saying that, you know, why would these people create this institution that is going to come back to bite them and investigate them? And in a way, this question is the question that also lies at the heart of the question of why would you create independent constitutional courts and
Yeah.
judicial review,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's my bread and butter. So when
Yeah.
you're having this discussion, I'm immediately
Yeah.
thinking about that, right? So
Yeah.
one possible solution is that you will only get an independent court under divided government, right? Because the parties will,
Yeah.
the political parties benefit from this thing, right? Other arguments are made ideational, right? It's about commitment, normative
Yeah.
commitment, blah, blah, blah. And there's this guy who wrote this super famous book and paper, and it's like, about the creation of the Supreme Court in Egypt, right? So why would a leader in an authoritarian country create a Supreme?
What's his name?
Hamid Mustafa.
Mustafa, okay.
And so Mustafa says that if you do it, if you were sending a signal,
Uh-huh.
that you are willing to commit yourself to some minimal type of oversight. And in his argument, it's to convince international
Yeah.
investors,
Yeah.
right? So I'm bringing this up because there are parallels between the
Yeah.
kind of institution that you're thinking
Yeah.
and these kinds of arguments
Yeah.
that might be helpful in the sense that maybe the term, or I struggle with the leader-led
Yeah.
part
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
argument
Yeah.
for reasons similar to maybe the ones that Alejandro posed and others that
Yeah.
we could also discuss.
Yeah.
And so maybe what you want to is talk about like either the normative commitment or the preferences or
Yeah.
stuff, because one can imagine a universe in which there's a president that would have used his, Aníbal says, no, don't be so naive. But do you see what
That's where we find out who the cynics are.
Yeah.
No, I hear you.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Not because I don't
Yeah.
see absolutely what these guys
Yeah,
are
yeah,
doing, but
yeah.
because if you frame it in more general terms of sending a signal, right?
Yeah.
What I'm doing is sending a signal to my domestic partners, to the international community.
Yeah.
Right? What I do with that signal
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and if the signal takes itself seriously and actually
Yeah.
commits to this, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yeah.
just say it's a more general
Yeah.
framework
Right.
that gets you into less
Yeah.
trouble, and then maybe looking into that can also help you talk about the divided government and
Yeah.
what creates autonomy
Autonomy. Yeah.
under these conditions,
Yeah.
right? All I'm saying. And then also, but you don't have to answer this now, is if you have negative cases.
So,
You, I have a beautiful 4x4 drawn in this thing, and I have, oh, yeah, I think then maybe there's a simpler way to map it, but
Well,
we don't have to go
yeah.
to my stupid 4x4 now,
Well,
but I have some suggestions.
I have an answer on the negative cases, but I don't wanna.
Yeah, no.
I'll talk to, yeah.
To Anima.
I have a very short
yeah, yeah.
fingers following up on Sandra, because this also connects to one idea I also would, recommend you or try to give you. You're focusing a lot on international and transnational interaction,
Yeah.
or at least your argument is very much in this direction. But then, following up on Sandra, I would like to see more of that,
Yeah.
because you want to make this argument
Yeah.
because it's international
Yeah.
organizations and so on. But taking into consideration the whole, zeitgeist,
Yeah.
panorama,
Yeah.
and why it's a signaling, to end legitimation strategy, domestic legitimation strategy for having international actors. So this is a connection you could strengthen.
Yeah. No, I think you all are right. And so I'll talk to you about the negative case. I guess, so originally I was thinking of this less as a question of why institutional design varies, and more as a question of why we get these and why we don't, which I would need a negative case for, right? But then I kind of, I moved away from that because it just got really complicated. But part of that was a kind of signaling argument, right? It's a kind of window dressing type of situation. So yeah, maybe it's worth, I guess, thinking about sort of going back to that. But I was trying to sort of posit there's a kind of consistent series of pressures and incentives, I think, that structure decisions around letting these things in, but there are all kinds of other dynamics that then shape what they look like, right? And so that's the way I was framing it, but you're looking skeptical, so I'm gonna pick your brain here. Yeah, Aniwa.
I have I think Maida has a comment. So
Oh, sorry, Maida.
We can separate.
No, just a small comment that I was wondering, because of the years that they were created, and also like the continuity between the peace process in Guatemala and what didn't happen in the other two countries, because I mean, part of the civil society story, I think, is like this continuation from the same people who were like struggling within the peace process, and they were the same people who like got the CICIG going on, right? They were around later. And I mean, just like this part of how important the peace process was for like civil society mobilization, I think is like a very big part of the story that it's not like.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And in the sort of written version of this, I talk about that a lot more. But then you also go to, well, Salvador had a peace process. And we don't see a kind of similar, and I guess, yeah, I don't see at least a similar thread between the Salvadoran peace process and the kind of anti-corruption struggle more generally, even pre the CCS. And so it is I think you're absolutely right that there's something about the peace process itself that feeds into this. And that's where when I think about the CCS as being deeply rooted in civil society, it's sort of deeply rooted in the Guatemalan human rights community that regenerated through the peace process, right? So yeah, I completely agree that that's an important part of this story. But then the question is, what do peace processes do sort of more broadly?
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but
I'm sorry, I talked too long.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.